Today we're going to talk about MiCA regulations and how it affects Firo and other privacy-preserving assets. MiCA, which stands for Markets in Crypto Assets, is an EU-wide regulation that has already been passed and approved and will be coming into force in 2024. And this regulation is meant to govern the issuance, the service providers who provide crypto assets in the whole of Europe, and is very influential. And as a result, privacy assets are also affected by MiCA regulations. And one of the stipulations within MiCA regulations is that exchanges cannot list assets that have inbuilt anonymization features. So on the face of it, it does look that Firo, Monero, and other privacy-preserving assets would be covered under this, and this would be a pretty big blow if we get removed or delisted from the entire EU market. So while tackling this problem, we have been in talks with several exchanges, especially our major ones like Binance, on how they would interpret this regulation and how they have been talking to regulators and how we can comply without sacrificing individual user privacy, or at least achieve a good balance between the two. Obviously, we understand there are people who are saying, why should we be complying with, sort of nebulous regulations? But the fact of the matter is that, if we do not comply, or at least, try to find a middle ground, being removed from the exchange on these important exchanges would actually mean a real hurt in adoption of Firo and other privacy assets. So I do think there is a middle ground to be drawn. We've also opened up a thread in our forum, I think about a month ago, and we encourage everyone to take a look to weigh in your opinions on that. And what we are actually proposing is the introduction of something what we call an exchange-only address. So Firo is already private by default, at least that is enforced by all our official wallets. And what that means is that transactions are private by default in nature, unless you choose to use a transparent address or you choose to disclose a view key, which will come later. An exchange-only address is something that was thought out by us in the sense that exchanges have taken a very hard stance and say they do not want to accept any transaction where the sender or amount is hidden. So in that case, like for example, a Lelanders transaction which actually hides the sender would not be accepted by an exchange. Similarly, mining rewards, masternode rewards, which also do not have an unidentified sender, even if it's a coin-based transactions, also would be kind of under this ban, where exchanges are not comfortable in accepting this under their own risk policies. So how do we get around this? There are several ways to approach this, but how do we approach this in a way that balances user privacy and also while complying and staying listed on these exchanges? So we have come up with an idea of exchange-only addresses which will only accept transactions that do have an identified sender. And when I mean identified sender, it doesn't mean that this address has KYC, a particular identity that is associated with it. All it means is that it comes from a normal transparent address, such as like in Bitcoin, where you can see who is the sender sending into the exchange. And the exchange itself may not know who actually owns this particular address, and you are free to create as many transparent addresses as you want, but they will only accept the funds from a transparent address. These exchange-only addresses will only appear at what we call the RPC level. That means like the average user will not be creating these exchange addresses. It will be created, using command line, and it will be handled only by exchanges who need these functions. Hence the name exchange-only addresses. So, regular users will probably be only using transparent addresses and more likely Spark addresses when they do come live with the launch of Lelanders Spark. So we have actually laid out a roadmap on how we plan to transition exchange-only addresses in and to encourage the usage of Lelanders Spark and our privacy anonymization features. So the first phase is to actually introduce exchange-only addresses, and we plan to do this before the end of the year. And the reason why is because MiCA regulations are coming into force next year. And the upside on this is that we have seen masternode providers and even miners themselves, they often mine directly to exchange addresses. With the implementation of exchange addresses, this will no longer be possible because the exchanges want to know who is the sender, right? So as a result, it would actually encourage regular miners, masternode providers to be mining to a full node address. That would also encourage them to use anonymization features. So on the one hand, yes, exchange-only addresses, does have much less privacy, but I do think that with centralized exchanges, there isn't too much of a high expectation of privacy. But at the same time, we are also allowing users and encouraging miners and masternode providers to be mining to our full node address. So that is the first phase, which will come into force by the end of this year. The second phase, which will happen after Spark launch on mainnet, which is going to be probably in January next year, is that we are going to make it mandatory for mining rewards and masternode rewards to go into Spark addresses. And what that means is that all new coin issuance will be entering into our shielded pool of Spark, Spark users, which really would be a huge improvement in privacy. So that will be the second phase. The third phase, which will also happen also in 2024, is the introduction of Helsing, which is basically allowing masternode providers to host their masternodes in Spark addresses. So we are trying to remove the reliance from transparent addresses as much as we can, at least for the regular user, but we still have those exchange-only addresses just for the purposes of compliance for the exchanges side. So after the completion of phase 3 comes the importance of introduction of more decentralized exchange options, and we want atomic swaps, bridging, and all of that to be in place. In a way, we can see that these measures to introduce exchange-only addresses is a way to buy us some time to actually allow us to develop this infrastructure so that we can reduce the reliance on centralized exchanges. Because eventually, we do see a point that there may be a line that is crossed that we are not willing to compromise just because for the reasons of compliance. Also, with the introduction of Spark assets or SPATs, basically which will allow people to create their own assets and to share in the anonymity set of Firo, basically every asset is indistinguishable from another one, would mean that the usage of Lelantus Spark would not just be limited to the anonymity set of Firo alone, but all other assets under the Firo ecosystem. So I hope that explains our strategy in tackling on how we're going to be balancing compliance with MiCA regulations and preserving our important centralized exchange listings while not compromising too much on user privacy. Again, I would like to reiterate that, this is something I would say is a necessary evil to keep adoption going, and centralized exchanges at this point in time do function as a very important on-ramp from fiat money into the crypto assets and Firo. And it also makes it a lot easier for Firo to be spent in the real world because of these on-ramps and off-ramps. So I would say that, philosophically, obviously, I would like to move into a mandatory private by default type of system, but I do think we need a bit more time before we are completely ready for that. So yes, so do please, weigh in on our forums if you have any opinions. We really would like to hear from our community, and we always appreciate feedback from our Firo fan.